to experience symptoms of vicarious traumatization. And we'll talk more about what that kind of looks like and what we can do about that. But do no harm is the first rule. And then really understanding what trauma means is one of the keys, because what we'll learn today about trauma I'm proposing will begin to help you make sense of these frustrating things. I propose to you that this afternoon, when you meet your client, the next client that you meet, if you find yourself saying, "Grr, gosh, why did they do that?" or why did they make that choice? Or why are they doing that behavior? The new question is going to be, why would they behave any other way? The question will be, boy, doesn't that really make sense? Doesn't it make sense that they operate that way? And then it becomes less frustrating because we now understand where it's coming from. And this is really the key of this discussion today, is really understanding some ideas about trauma and what we know about trauma now. And we're starting to know a lot, which is exciting. So let's just take a look at trauma. What is trauma? Trauma, traumatic stress. So it's an experience, and one of the key pieces of the experience is that it overwhelms the person's ability or their personal resources for coping. So it results in vulnerability, loss of control. People are helpless and fearful. And it starts to interfere negatively with relationships and belief. And traumatic responses are different in different people, even to the same event. And I've got one very quick example of that. Here in Madison, we had a monster truck rally. I don't know if it's been it must be a couple years now, that there was an accident and a person was literally killed right there in the middle of the performance, where, and I don't know how many people are in the Coliseum, but we'll just say 10,000 people all saw this thing. So there were 10,000 different kinds of trauma responses. And I had a client who took her son to it, and she was really worried that her son was really going to, really struggle with that, and it was really going to affect him. But the kid went home, he was 7, and he took his own monster truck, and he just started driving over things. He was like driving on the walls and driving on the counter and driving over Mom and driving over the dog, and drove his monster truck, and he was okay. Didn't have any behavior difficulties, was sleeping, there just didn't appear to be any kind of traumatic stress reaction there at all. However, Mom couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about it. And turns out that one of the things she couldn't stop thinking about was the loss of a son that she had at age 2 to drowning. And even though she did not see her son dead, drowning, she had, that's all she could picture. That's all she could picture. So for this particular woman, her memory networks started being activated. And in fact, if you think about sort of the most recent person you've lost via death, and do you ever find yourself starting to think about other folks that you've lost? If you notice that, sorry about that. If you notice that's an evidence of your memory networks getting connected, and the neural connections and the neural pathways, memories are linked together. And so when one memory fires up, other memories can come up along with it. So multiple responses to the same event. So different people will have different responses. Trauma itself is an injury of memory. Trauma is an injury of memory. The past is present. And let's take a look at that example of my client. She witnessed somebody be killed, an adult person be killed by a monster truck, yet all she could think about was her son, who was 2 years old, and she could picture him having drowned, when she did not actually ever see that. So the past was present for her. She could not get that off her mind. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is probably a word you've heard over and over again, is a clinical diagnosis. That's a clinical diagnostic label. And in fact, what we know of PTSD today, and those of you who've had your diagnosis class in your mental health training, know that that comes from the DSM manual. And what we call PTSD today, and label it as such, will be called something entirely different in the next version of the diagnostic manual that's going to come out in a couple of years. So PTSD is what we call it today. And that is one specific label that if you meet a particular criteria, and that is to say one of each of these that falls in these clusters, you can be given the clinical diagnosis of PTSD. But of course, not everybody who experiences a traumatic event will meet criteria for PTSD. Because again, trauma reactions are different for different people. But let's take a look at these clusters of symptoms for a moment in the context of behaviors and the things that we might see in the clients that we serve. Flashbacks can be as obvious as literally re-experiencing flashbacks, but also something like nightmares and night terrors. And I think this comes up here. I think this is a great practical example to think about for a second, especially those of us who work in the shelter. When someone doesn't really want to sleep, someone who's just kind of up a lot, and you're kind of going, if you're the overnight staff, they kind of want to talk, or they're, kind of distracting you, and you got to start the laundry, you got things to do, and you're not really in a place where you can sit and chat all night. But this person doesn't really want to go to bed, and if we can, at first we might go, gosh, man, you need to go to bed. But if you stop and think, and let's drop the trauma lens in there, and let's ask the question, why would they behave any other way? Because why wouldn't that person possibly not want to go to sleep? Could it possibly be that something had happened to them at some point at night in their sleep while they were in their bed, and the bed will remind them of that? But also, people can experience flashbacks in their sleep, and that sometimes we might call that something like a night terror, where people are sleeping, but they're literally having flashbacks. They're back in the moment. The past is present. And traumatized people are notoriously, they struggle with sleep. And it ends up being a real biological brain issue. And it'll fall into place for you as we keep going. But you might be familiar with that people really struggle with sleep and struggle to get a good night's sleep. And then even that difficulty starts to affect health and mental health. And then there's avoidance. From that very obvious behavior of avoiding people, avoiding places, avoiding those things that are triggers for them, but also in more subtle ways like feeling detached, being outside of your body, something called derealization or depersonalization, or something we know as dissociation. And dissociation doesn't necessarily mean something like multiple personalities or things like that. It's really not being present in your body. It's really not being in your body and noticing the sensations in your body. Kids are actually very good dissociators when they daydream. Or if you've ever driven a particular stretch of road and you kind of come back for a second and go, hey, wait a minute, how did I get here? Or did I miss that exit? You were not present. That's one example, a very simple form of dissociation. So it's not necessarily a Dissociation is not necessarily a bad thing or something that we should be afraid of, because we really all do it, and it's a way to be safe. It's a way to protect ourselves from experiencing danger. And arousal, the cluster arousal comes out a lot of times. People have anger problems, and certainly in the shelter, folks. Conflicts arise, can actually erupt very quickly because of perceived, misperceived danger or misperceived offenses towards somebody, right? And you might